You know, life has a way of teaching us lessons we don't always want to learn. Some are gentle nudges, others hit you like a freight train. This story I'm about to tell you, it's one of those freight trains. It's a tale of betrayal, revenge, and the kind of secrets that can eat away at a person until there's nothing left but regret. It all started back in 1952, here in this very town. Back then, it wasn't much more than a sleepy little place where everyone knew each other's business, or thought they did. My father, Henry Whitaker, was the town clockmaker. He had a small shop on Main Street right next to the bakery. You could smell fresh bread wafting through the air while he worked on his clocks, ticking and talking away like some sort of mechanical symphony. People said my father had a gift, not just for fixing clocks, but for understanding time itself. Time heals all wounds, he used to say. But what he didn't realize was that sometimes time only deepens them. My mother, Eleanor, was the prettiest woman in town. Everyone said so. She had these piercing blue eyes that seemed to see straight through you, and hair the color of autumn leaves. They were happy once, my parents, or at least that's what I believed when I was young. But happiness, like anything else fragile, can shatter if you're not careful. The trouble began with a man named Victor Langston. He rolled into town one summer afternoon in a shiny black Cadillac, wearing a suit that looked like it cost more than most people made in a year. Victor was charming, smooth-talking, and full of stories about his travels across Europe and Asia. He claimed to be a businessman looking to invest in local enterprises, and naturally he took a keen interest in my father's clock shop. At first my father welcomed him. Who wouldn't? Victor brought excitement to our quiet lives. He'd stop by the shop every few days, chatting with my father about gears and springs, asking questions that sounded intelligent enough to fool anyone who didn't know better. And then, inevitably, he'd turn the conversation toward Eleanor. "Your wife must be quite the remarkable woman," he'd say, flashing that disarming smile of his. "How does she stand being married to a man who spends all day surrounded by ticking machines?" Looking back now, I can see how calculated it all was, how Victor wormed his way into our lives bit by bit until he became a regular fixture at our dinner table. My mother laughed at his jokes, listened intently to his stories, and even started dressing up for their little business meetings. At the time, I thought nothing of it. I was just a boy, barely 10 years old, too busy chasing frogs down by the creek to notice the cracks forming beneath the surface, but my father noticed. Oh, how he noticed. I remember the night it all came undone. It was late, long after I should have been asleep, but I woke up to the sound of raised voices coming from downstairs. Creeping out of bed, I tiptoed to the top of the stairs and peeked through the banister. There they were, my father, red-faced and trembling with anger, and my mother, tears streaming down her cheeks. Between them stood Victor, cool as a cucumber, holding something in his hand. A letter. "I found this in your coat pocket," my father spat, pointing an accusing finger at my mother. "Care to explain?" She didn't answer, just stared at the floor like a child caught stealing cookies. That's when Victor stepped forward, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Henry, my friend, perhaps we should discuss this calmly." "Don't call me your friend," my father roared, cutting him off. "You snake! You think I don't know what's been going on? Sneaking around behind my back, whispering sweet nothings to my wife?" Victor's expression changed then, ever so slightly. The mask slipped, revealing the cold, calculating man underneath. "If you must know," he said, his tone suddenly sharp, "Eleanor and I have grown close, very close. She deserves better than a dusty old clockmaker who can't give her the life she dreams of." I'll never forget the look on my father's face. It was like someone had punched him in the gut and stolen the air from his lungs. For a moment he just stood there, frozen, before turning to my mother. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me it isn't true." She couldn't meet his eyes. Instead she nodded, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Something inside my father broke that night. I saw it happen, plain as day. One moment he was a man, flawed but whole. The next he was a shadow of himself, hollowed out by betrayal. What happened next is something I've replayed in my mind countless times over the years. Some might call it justice, others would call it madness. But whatever it was, it changed everything. A week later, Victor announced that he was leaving town. He'd decided to take Eleanor with him, of course. They planned to start a new life somewhere far away, where no one would judge them for what they'd done. My father didn't try to stop them. Not directly, anyway. Instead, he spent those final days working feverishly in his shop, building something unlike anything he'd ever created before. On the morning of their departure, Victor came to the shop one last time. He wanted to settle accounts, he said, though I suspect he also wanted to gloat. My father greeted him warmly, almost cheerfully, and handed him a beautifully crafted pocket watch, a parting gift, he said, to remember me by. Victor examined the watch, impressed despite himself. "Very nice," he said. "Almost makes me feel guilty for taking your wife." "Open it," my father urged, ignoring the jab. "There's an inscription inside." Curious, Victor popped open the lid, and that's when it happened. A loud echoed through the shop, followed by a sharp hiss. Before anyone could react, a cloud of fine white powder burst from the watch, enveloping Victor in a choking haze. He stumbled backward, coughing violently, clutching at his throat. Within seconds, he collapsed to the floor, convulsing. My father watched silently as Victor writhed in agony, his body jerking uncontrollably. When the spasms finally stopped, there was nothing left but stillness. Dead silence. Eleanor screamed, of course. She ran to Victor's side, sobbing hysterically, but it was too late. Whatever poison my father had hidden inside that watch had done its job. As for my father, he simply turned away, wiped his hands on his apron, and walked out of the shop without a word. They found Victor's body hours later. By then, my father and I were long gone. We packed up what little we could carry and disappeared into the night, leaving behind the only home we'd ever known. Rumors spread quickly, of course. Some said Victor had died of a heart attack. Others whispered about foul play. No one suspected my father. He was too mild-mannered, too unassuming, too broken. We ended up in Chicago, where my father opened another clock shop under a different name. He never spoke of Eleanor or Victor again, not once. But I could see the toll it took on him, the guilt, the shame, the endless nights spent staring at the ceiling. Time didn't heal his wounds as he'd always claimed it would. If anything, it made them worse. As for me, well, I suppose I inherited his knack for understanding time, not the kind you measure with clocks, but the kind that shapes our lives. The moments that define us, for better or worse. And let me tell you something, revenge may feel satisfying in the moment, but it doesn't bring peace. All it leaves behind is emptiness. So, if there's one thing I've learned from this story, it's this. Hold on to forgiveness tighter than you hold on to anger. Because in the end, time waits for no one, and neither does regret.